Hi everyone and welcome to the self-knowledge lectures. Today we are going to be studying the lecture number 39, a very interesting topic that will teach us about the importance of stopping identifying ourselves with each of the circumstances that we live in our daily lives, and also about the importance of stopping criticizing, judging, right, other people's. Because putting an end to these two errors in which we so frequently fail will allow us to ensure that this consciousness that we are trying to awaken, right, with the inner work doesn't fall asleep. Remember that in these self-knowledge lectures, we are receiving all the tools, right? All the information also that we need in order to know ourselves and to awaken our consciousness. And well, remember that if you want to receive all these lectures and the complementary material on these lectures, you can join our WhatsApp or our Telegram groups where we share for free all these lectures, all the complementary material. Here in the description of this video, you can find the link to join us, right, and receive all these important topics. And well, in today's lecture, let's start by talking a little about what we mean with non-identification, right? So we get to understand what it means to identify ourselves with something, and so that we can understand how is it that we so frequently fail into identification with the different circumstances that happens to us in our daily living. And also, let's see, or let's try to understand that when we identify ourselves with something, we forget ourselves. Our consciousness falls asleep in the state of wakefulness, and that alert perception, that self-remembering in which consciousness can manifest itself in us, is lost. So to identify ourselves is when we become identical to one of our psychological defects in the face of a given circumstance. It is letting a defect take over our body, take over a human machine. So we begin to react, to think, to feel, and to act like that defect, right? We fall totally asleep and we become totally identified with the situation and with the defect arising in us. For example, if during an argument, we identify ourselves with the anger that arises in us, we will become identical to that anger before that situation. Then we're going to end up mistreating, screaming. We only think on hurting, on humiliating, on taking revenge. And we can only feel, right, hatred, resentment, and so on. This is all part of the angry defect with which we have become identical in the face of that situation. So when we identify ourselves with any situation and the defect arising there, we let the defect take over all the centers of a human machine. Let's say it is a lustful situation that we face in our day, right? If we fail to maintain that self-remembering state, so that the consciousness is the one who is there in self-observation, maintaining like control over a human machine, then we are going to become identical to the laws that start emerging in us, and we are going to feel, to think, to speak, to act literally, right? Because when we identify ourselves, we look at wakefulness. Because loss there is taking over. So we make mistakes, we waste our available sexual energy, and we degenerate ourselves even more. And all this thanks to the identification in which we fail under that circumstance, right? The same when we face with the various circumstances of our lives. We become identified with fear, with worry, sadness, anxiety, envy, laziness, depression, anguish, whatever, and we lose ourselves, right? We lose our consciousness. And the problem with identifying ourselves is that identification puts the consciousness to sleep. When we identify ourselves, we fail or we fall, into the fascination and into the unconsciousness of the psychological dream. And as long as any psychological defect is acting in a person, consciousness cannot be acting. Consciousness can only act in us when we remain in the present moment, in self remembering, self observing ourselves. There, in that awareness of ourselves, is that our consciousness can manifest. We already know that awakening consciousness requires continuous efforts, right, to maintain that state, to maintain self observation, to be able to identify and to eliminate all the psychological defects or egos that manifest in us at every moment in the face of the very situations we experience, because there in those defects is trapped all the consciousness that we lacked right now. And what our defects do is to make us identify ourselves with them before the various situations to get us out of that state of wakefulness, so that they can act in us, so that can come and they can take over our centers and they can steal the energy of our centers and lead us to make mistakes, right? If we fall into identification with any of the situations that we experience on daily basis, we allow ourselves to be fascinated by the scenario that the psychological defects is presenting before us. We don't see situations, we don't see the reality. We're not able to see things as they really are, right? But we think, we fear, we imagine, we feel in that psychological dream as consciousness falls asleep. But if we practice, for example, retrospection at night, we will realize how we remain identified, forgetting ourselves throughout the day. This is how we walk. This is how we live, sleep during the day. And for that reason, at night, we cannot consciously go out to the astral plane because we are dreaming during the day. We are dreaming, we are walking dreaming, right? And we continue dreaming during the night. So if we really want to awaken consciousness, we must start by awakening from this daily dreaming. We must begin to understand and see life as a movie in which we have pleasant scenes, but also very unpleasant scenes. However, they are all scenes. They are all fleeting, right? Everything we experience in this physical world is temporary. It is taken by time. People pass, ideas pass, things pass. The whole world is illusory. Any sin in life, no matter how strong it is, it passes and is left behind in time. The only thing that doesn't pass is the being, it's our consciousness, because the being is eternal. So the only thing that we should really take care of, that should really interest us, is the being, is our consciousness, because the being is the being. The rest is illusory and is temporary. One in life sometimes encounters some difficult problems, right? It happens that sometimes we don't see a way or a solution to a situation, and it becomes like enormous, monstrous, gigantic before our mind. Since when we have a problem, whatever the problem is, we tend to magnify the problem by putting a lot of mental and a lot of emotional energy into that situation. That is how we make problems out of fleeting situations, right? We worry too much and we keep thinking and thinking about it until we start to feel like small, right? Like if we are unable to face and to solve that problem, and we start to perceive the problem as something too big that has no solution. And then one succumbs to worries and we say, how will I do? What will I do? We cannot find like that escape, and the problem becomes more monstrous, more enormous, gigantic, to the extent that one continues to think about that problem. And when we come to see a problem as a monster that we cannot handle, at that moment, our identification is enormous, right? Our consciousness is there totally asleep. We begin with the mechanical imagination to project that the worst things are going to happen. that we are going to end up in jail, that our children will starve, that we will be embarrassed, and so on. So we must observe how we tend to get this into these fatalistic mental projections, and we must understand how all this negativity fits very, very heavy defects in ourselves, which actually reinforce as circumstances so that it remains and it is constantly repeated. And while we are imagining all those, for us, possible catastrophic scenarios, we are actually suffering a lot. And we are suffering as if that was real. Yeah, as if all that were already happening. We can see how, by falling into identification, there are people who end up committing suicide, right? Because circumstance in life turned into a huge problem in their minds. And that monster became too big for them, and they end up taking their lives, right? If we understand this topic that we are dealing with today, in any hard situation, we are going to remember that what happens to us is nothing more than a passing circumstance, like and seen in the movie of our lives, like everything else in this world. And we will seek to eliminate, because that is like the key point, to find through self observation and to eliminate the psychological defects that are there acting, because all situations that comes to our lives comes to bring something, to bring us a lesson, right? That situation is there coming so that we can find the psychological defects that are there acting, so that we can find our weaknesses, so that we can find our mechanical reactions, right? So we can find our anger, so we can find our lust, so we can find our envy, so we can find that lack of lack of confidence in our inner being, in our consciousness, right? And well, the defects there are actually hidden, right? They have trapped the consciousness that has like the virtue that we are lacking right now. So normally it is seen that problems are due to fear. The self of fear actually is the one that keeps all the problems alive. You fear life, you fear death, you fear what people will say, what people will think of you, the slender, the misery, the hunger, the prison, everything is feared. And because of this, problems become more and more stronger, like something that has no solution. So if we want to solve a problem, we must take like the bull by the horns, and we must discover what fears are behind that problem. If we face the problem as it is, that is, if we take the bull by the horns, we see that the problem turns into nothing, because when we manage to find the fear that is behind that defect, and we manage to find the psychological defects that is there holding that fear, and we eliminate that psychological defect, then the problem, you're gonna see, turns into nothing. It comes to to destroy itself, because the problems are illusory in nature. For example, in an economic problem, what do we fear? We fear going to jail. We fear that the family will suffer, that they will go hungry. We fear ruin, etc. And all those fears plunges into hell. But the thing is, what are my psychological defects there that are making me fear that? And when we destroy them, then we rescue the consciousness that has a solution, that makes us see things from above, from a higher point of view. And then we can simply find the solution. Of a really problem, what do we fear? We in that situation could discover defects that are afraid of what others will say, of scandal. There is our pride, right? Defects of attachments, defects that are afraid of losing certain pleasures, interests that they have in that person, and so on. But it happens that if the I of fear is eliminated, by eliminating all those details that are giving strength to that fear, then everything disappears. This is like magical. It becomes nothing. Everything like finds by itself a solution because consciousness is like this. So discovering the fears that are giving the strength and shape to that problem is actually taking the bull by the horns. We are really facing it there. Then one begins to understand that consciousness doesn't feel fear at all. Consciousness is actually full wisdom. So who feels those fears? The psychological defects through mechanical imagination are there, creating that hell for us. So if we become identified with any event, problem, situation, we can always be, I mean, if we never become identified, we can always be alert. We can be vigilant of ourselves. And it is in that state of alertness when we discover those psychological defects, then we understand them and we eliminate them by with the help of our inner divine mother. So when we eliminate those psychological defects that are causing those fears, that have us projecting all those situations, we are going to see that consciousness can manifest. And consciousness can resolve any situation because it is full wisdom, right? We tend to believe that we are going to find the solution to our problems by worrying, by searching the solutions with our minds. We lose the peace of mind, and we even fall into insomnia, right? We must come to understand that as long as we are identified with the problem, we will not reach a real solution. Because in that state, consciousness, which is the light of our being, cannot manifest and cannot illuminate us, right? So, also, it is important to always see problems as what they are, opportunities. Since in the most pleasant moments of our life, our inner work tends to perform less. So it is in pleasant circumstances that we fail to fall into that let's say the quietness, because there's not as much material to rescue consciousness. However, it is in the most complicated situations where the heaviest defects of our psychology arise in us, which have trapped the greatest amount of our consciousness. And if we learn to wisely see the difficult circumstances that we have in life, then they become for us wonderful opportunities for self-discovery, right? For rescuing consciousness. If, for example, at work, someone insults us, and at that moment, instead of reacting, we maintain that state of wakefulness, self-observation. We begin to observe what happens in our inner world. We start self-observing all those things that are arising. Then consciousness is actually having a feast because there is a lot of essences that can be rescued from that situation. But when we identify ourselves, then we fail to identify the defect that is manifesting. And normally, what we do is that we project those defects that live inside us onto other people. When we are in a state of intolerance, we see others as intolerant, right? When we are in a state of tyranny, wanting to impose our point of view in others, we see the other as a tyrant. Our defects always try to make us fall into identification so that we don't identify them. And thus we can not discover them and eliminate them. So we must begin to see how defects make of us what they want. And we must understand that as long as we are identified with the defect, it will be very difficult for us to even become aware of what defect it is manifesting, right? For esoteric work, it is essential to begin a stage of incessant struggle to not identify with any psychological element, whatever it may be, if we really want to advance in this psychological path, right? And well, now talking about why we judge others, it is necessary to know that we don't really know ourselves, and that all the people on the outside serve as a mirror to see ourselves reflected on them. And if every time that someone with a defect appears, we observe ourselves, we are going to be able to identify that something is manifesting inside us and that it doesn't want us to observe it. And that is why it tries to get us react, to get us point, to get us criticize what this or that person is doing. So it can put our consciousness to sleep, and so that we cannot discover the ego inside, right? And actually, what bothers us about someone is always something that we carry hidden within our psychology and that we don't like to see from the outside, and that is why we criticize it. So the law of the mirror shows us that everything we see in other people is what is most like deeply rooted within us. If a person, for example, is very lustful, we always see, I mean, if we are like very lustful, right, we are going to see lust in other people always. If we are irresponsible, we are going to see responsibility in other people. If we are lazy, we are going to see all others as lazy ones. So the best way to get to know ourselves is to see what is it that we criticize the most. There we will discover amazing things about ourselves, because we will discover things that are deeply rooted within us and that until that moment we had not even recognized, much less accepted, right? In other reactions, we can discover that internally we have the opposite defect to what we see externally. For example, if I see someone who is wasting his money, and I have the greedy self inside of me, then that greedy self is going to react when it sees its opposite on the outside. It is like the same defects. It's just like the two faces of one coin. It is the same, but in this case, it's polarized in the other stream in my interior. And when I see the opposite there, I feel displeasure, because the ego is offended when it sees its reflection, right? And that is the reason why, in the face of everything that we haven't worked on within ourselves, and of which therefore we have no understanding, we usually feel irritation, you usually feel rejection. That is the reason. If we really had the opposite virtue, let's say, to that defect, because we have already worked on that defect, understood and eliminate that defect on ourselves, then we wouldn't criticize it, but rather we would understand that person, right? We can see like a simple example with the alcoholic, for example. He who drinks alcohol is in the active polarity of the defect, while in the passive polarity, that is their abstainer, right? But being abstemious doesn't imply that you have an understanding of the alcoholic defect, or that you have already rescued the virtue that is opposite to that defect. But it means that you only have the alcoholic defect repressed in your psychology. And this is revealed every time that you feel displeasure or rejection, or that you make the mistake of criticizing that person who is constantly there drinking, right? Who's actively feeding the alcoholic defect. On the contrary, those who have already studied, understood, eliminated their alcoholic defect, they already know the strategies of the defect. They already know how the defect subdues the person, then the justifications that are installed in the mind of for letting the defect act and so on, and they already understand it, right? And therefore, instead of criticizing the alcoholic who is being manipulated by that defect, they rather try to help him by giving them the knowledge, this knowledge, by giving them the tools so they can get out of there, if he wishes so, of course. So the key to everything is always to direct the observation to our inner world. Self-observation is always the key, so that we can discover what we are feeling, what we are thinking, what we are desiring, the way that we are reacting, the internal chatter that occurs in the face of any defect, any wrong thing, any mistake that we observe other people doing. As one observe one's inner world, one makes many discoveries, and we can gradually eliminate the psychological defects that we are there understanding. But if identification is given, the next step will be criticism. As soon as we identify ourselves, we begin to judge the other person. We criticize the defect that we have projected onto that person. So let's think a little about this. If we don't know ourselves, right? How can we believe that we know others? That is why we judge any appearance or any actions we see in others. But we should never identify with appearances because appearances can be deceiving. You know that. For example, we look at a person on the streets or on social networks doing a certain thing, and then immediately criticism begins. Ah, that's a prostitute. Oh, that other one is an effeminate. That one there is such and such. The other one that comes there is a thief, and so on. But who is judging? If we look at the pointing hand, right, we'll see that one finger, yes, is pointing outward, right, while three other fingers are pointing inward. They are our psychological defects that are there, criticizing on the outside what we have on the inside. We have to realize that what we are judging about others is appearance. We don't really know the psychological reasons that force a person to act in a certain way. We simply see an external circumstance and we judge the external appearance, right? So when we see someone doing something that generates reaction, irritation in ourselves, we must immediately direct our attention to our inner world to find, understand, and eliminate the defect that is there reacting. Also, to discover, remember, from which polarity it is manifesting, understand it, and eliminate it so as not to fall into the error of criticism and not continue to have to experience the terrible consequences that criticizing brings us, right? Because when we criticize others, and that is a consequence, we cannot observe ourselves because our vision is totally focused on what the other does or say. So we lose the wonderful opportunity to self-discovery and to transform ourselves, right? And another consequence, the consciousness falls asleep and we lose what is known as the critical judgment, which is the ability of consciousness to understand its own defects. But that ability disappears as soon as we criticize another person, right? When we criticize others, we cannot judge ourselves because we justify ourselves. Because when we criticize others, it is because we feel superior, right? And much better than the one we are criticizing. And we must understand that criticism is the strategy that our psychological defects use so that we never discover them. And since the person who criticizes doesn't understand because he hasn't learned anything from that defect, he is then put on the other person's shoes. You're gonna see that you are going to end up living that very same situation, and of course, you are going to end up acting just like the one you are criticizing or worse. So that is another consequence of criticism. And we must know that the judgment that we make is a wrong judgment, always. Since if we don't know ourselves, the less we will know all the internal situations, nuances that led a person to act as they do. And what happens with that wrong judgment? That judgment is actually a slender, which ends up creating a bad relationship between the person judged and us. And actually, in esotericism, what truly matters is the way we are internally related to each other. If I judge someone, I become his enemy. That's a reality. And when we criticize a person and slender that person, it happens that we identify ourselves and we lose the possibility of self-observing, of self-judging, and well, we cannot grow, right? And well, another important consequence of criticism is that it generates karma. Since through criticism we harm others, right? We are, remember, not charged karma for what we think or what we feel, but when we take it to an action or to a word, we already generate direct or indirect damage, and that generates karma. And then let's reflect on this, and let's reflect also on what would be the benefits of combating these two errors. What benefits we will obtain if we stop identifying ourselves and if we stop criticizing? Well, first is that our consciousness will not fall asleep. We will have the ability to achieve a state of continuous consciousness that will lead us to full awakening, right? We will begin to be conscious during the day, right? And this will be reflected in greater spaces of consciousness on the astral plane. In addition, we will recover that fantastic critical judgment capacity. Self-criticism is actually essential. It allows us to see our own defects reflected there in front in the other person. And if we become aware that we have a defect, we can ask for the elimination of the defects. Though psychological depth work will perform impressively if we do not identify ourselves and if we don't fail into the error of criticism, right? We'll be continuously releasing consciousness, and we will advance in our inner work. So it is very important to start a fight to stop judging others and to stop identifying ourselves. That fight is going to lead us to what is called the awakening of consciousness. This fight is going to take place in those two fronts, not identifying ourselves and not judging others. If we achieve victory over these two mistakes that we commonly fall into, we will make great progress on our path to awakening. And well, people, this has been today's topic. Remember to leave us any question or comments if you have them. And I want to invite you to our next topic that we are going to be studying next week, in which we are going to discuss a very important lecture, the 40th lecture of the self-knowledge course, in which we will talk in depth about the third factor for the revolution of consciousness, which is sacrifice for humanity. In that conference, we will understand the vital importance of that factor. So you're cordially invited to join us in developing that interesting topic. So thank you very much to all of you who are here watching these lectures. Thank you very much for sharing these lectures to others. And well, see you the next time. Bye bye.